It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman.
This is Dan Jurgen.
This is Jason J. Lewis, the voice of Superman on Justice League Action.
This is Mark Wade, writer of Superman Birthright.
And you're listening to The Krypton Report.
The Krypton Report podcast is dedicated to all things Superman, Supergirl, and the planet Krypton. We discuss movies, TV, game, comics, and all things DC. So join me, Tyler, with my co-host James and Jania. Welcome to the Krypton Report. And this episode is going to be another one of those awesome interviews I've been having with different podcasters and fellow geeks. Now, the following interview I had is a gentleman who I've had the pleasure of being on his podcast and discuss different things, but this is his first time being here with us. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, how you doing? Actually, I think it's my second time. I mean, first time for this kind of session, but we did, I think, one of the Superman for All season.
We did. You did. Yeah, this is the first time. Let me clarify. He joined me and James and Brian for one of our comic reviews, but this is the first time just him and I kind of talking. So I had to clarify. But I've been doing this series where I've been talking to fellow geek podcasters and just kind of talking about, their love of either Superman, or in your case, you and I have had a great time talking. We talked Superman Birthright and all seasons, but then we also talked American Vampire, which is a Scott Snyder creator-owned book that I love. So I thought, you know what? It'd be great to just talk about some different things with you. But to get started, why don't you go ahead and kind of introduce yourself and the different podcasts that you're on, because your podcast has a great story of where you started and then you joined a network.
Yeah. So I got into podcasting. I think I'm in year 3 of doing my show, World's Finest True Believers. And basic concept is that a guest comes on and they select a comic book arc or graphic novel from any publisher. And, we do a deep dive into the writer, the artist, the background of how it's created. The guests get to talk about their favorite moments, their favorite parts. And then, at the end, we look at the impact, not only the work it had on the industry, but also the impact it had on guests. And so it kind of, I was inspired by a lot of the same people that, we travel in the same circles with, like Broadcast, DC on Screen. It's modeled after, if you ever listen to Lisa's I Love That Movie, it's basically modeled after her podcast, just in comic. So, go ahead.
No, I just had the pleasure of recording with Lisa. Her and I have been trying to record for almost a year, it seemed like. And I just did, in October here, I did The Wolfman. Her and I talked about it. And one thing that I told her, and I'll reiterate with your podcast, is it's neat because in some ways it can take you out of your bubble. I read a lot of DC. I'm not against reading Marvel, but I just only have so much time. And for a while there, Marvel didn't have the stories I like, but some did. I'm not just saying that, but I read Mark Waid's Daredevil, and some Jeff Loeb in Marvel, and I read The Ultimate Spider-Man. But having someone say, hey, I want to talk about this, like you do, forces you to then, okay, well, I'm going to read this and I'm going to learn about it. So it's a great way of expanding your industry knowledge in a way.
Oh, yeah. No, that's the biggest reason. I mean, besides just getting to share my geekdom and also getting the opportunity, and I've got basically by the end of the year, I don't think we'll hit 70 recorded by the end of the year, but it'll come close to the following year. We'll start hitting 70s, but it's also bringing in stories and books I've never read before. And even the ones that I have read, I've always enjoyed delving into the history of how these are created or these graphic novels were created, if that's the. So that's kind of like what I really enjoy about doing the show. And so with that, doing the show, leading to what you said, getting on a podcast network, I think it was definitely within the first year and a half of doing the show, Travis Snell, who's one of the guys over who goes They do Geekverse podcast, and they had been around for as long as they've been and garnered a listener base and things like that. That their platform Spreaker had given them a network fee. They hadn't done anything with it, so in traveling through different circles, being on different shows, getting to meet them and know them, last March is 2020 March. He came to me with the idea that saying, "Hey, I really like your show. We're doing this idea for a network called Geek Ultimate Alliance, and I would love World's Finest to be a part of it. I'd also love you to host a show on the network. I totally understand if you don't want to bring World's Finest, but I at least want to have you on the network." And I really had no reason to keep World's Finest from, my whole thing was not only just, doing this as my side hobby at that point, but also getting a chance to grow the listener base of being part of a network with a established podcast like Geekverse behind me. It allowed me to really grow and bring it to a new audience. So bringing World's Finest over and then starting, and I'm one of the co-hosts of a show called Marvel Alliance, where it's a weekly show where we dive into all the news going into Marvel, whether it be movies, streaming, or comics. At the time, Travis Snell was my co-host, and he's had a changeover in getting promotion at work and a new baby, so he's had to step away. And my new co-host, Brent, is my new co-host. Been get ready for almost 6-7 months at this point, but he's the co-host of Fans Without Borders on Podcast Media, so he's a very seasoned podcaster. But in starting my own show through that network and also carrying on World's Finest, one of the biggest things I like about World's Finest is that I wish I could make it weekly, but I can't because I really spend a lot of time doing the research into writers, the artists, the background. Some books that are guest choose take really quick in my searches. Other ones take a lot of time. And there's only been, I think, one book that there was never anything specifically written about why it was created, and that was Superman Speeding Bullets, the Elseworld story by J.M. Mateus.
Interesting.
And so it was just, it's a small Elseworlds tale. It's a popular one, but it didn't garner necessarily outside of one or two lines mentioned. So what I did on that episode was we just delved into it was actually the second Elseworld tale, but the first one that we've ever covered Kingdom Come. But with that one, we just looked at the idea of Elseworlds. But that led to me actually getting connected with J.M. Mateus, because when we re-released the episode, he actually listened to it.
Nice.
And had tweeted out saying, "Great episode." And so I messaged him, "Would love to have you," because I do these occasional things with World's Finest with my friend Clay on the network, who hosts Ranger Alliance, DC Alliance on the network, that do these creator spotlights. And took a shot in the dark. Hey, we do these creator spotlights. Like, come on. And he did. And it was amazing. It's like a dream come true talking with one of my favorite writers of all time. But these creator spotlights, I've gotten a chance to talk with, Matt Groom, who's doing the Ultraman comic, and then getting to talk to two upcoming artist writers. And then our first one was with the showrunner for Lucifer. And so it's just a side project. We haven't had a new creator spotlight in a while. It's one that I reach out to different creators, and sometimes they respond back, sometimes they don't. I don't take offense because, again, some of them are pretty busy, but it's something I can always throw in there just as a change of pace and doing stuff. But doing World's Finest has allowed me to really even get people who I've looked up to in my podcasting journey and geek journey to have on my show, and just them taking the time. It's just a really cool feeling, and I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, you bring out Speeding Bullets. That is one that we are going to tackle here January or February. I can't remember where it is on the schedule. Okay. Because I read it once before, a long time ago, but it's part of our Batman the Batman ramp up.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to do a couple things, just talking about Batman, getting ready for that film. Because, we can talk about other DC heroes too.
Yeah.
So yeah, that one, it's one I've been like itching to read again, but I was like, hold off, Tyler. Hold off. But, that's really awesome that you're able to talk to him. I've heard him talk a couple times, and he just seems like a really great guy to talk with. And especially because, he's, for our listeners, he wrote the script for Red Son, the animated film. And that kind of surprised me, because sometimes seeing comic book writers write scripts is not uncommon.
Mm-hmm. But
when it's not like their story, it just kind of makes you perk up like, oh, okay, that's cool, But yeah. So, you started that podcast, but what got you into comics? Where does your comic book history, your journey, your love for these funny books, as some people say, where does that start?
I would say, like a lot of people, it was, as a kid, just getting into enjoying Batman and just reading as a kid. Batman is one of my favorite, if not the favorite, at least on the DC side, superheroes. And so reading as a kid, collecting comics as a kid, not necessarily because I was thinking they're worth it or anything kind of money. It was just reading them and watching movies, watching the TV shows, the cartoons. It was really, something that, meant a lot to me at that point. And so with that in mind, I like with everything, life happens. I kind of get out of it. I enjoy the movies. I don't collect comics for a while, and then I get back into it in college when I start I had friends that were still into comics and got me back into it. And one of the first books that I got back into that hooked me back in was Identity Crisis by Brian Melton. And I know the controversy surrounding the book. I know it could be, somewhat divisive at that point, but it is one of my favorite books because it showed me a new journey into what, comics had evolved into. So, and that's kind of how I got into and got back into collecting and reading comics.
That was one of those stories that when I read that particular book, it was one of those, I didn't know anything about it. I just was at Dalton Books inside the mall, and they had buy 3 graphic novels, get 1 free. And I found Kingdom Come, Identity Crisis. I'm trying to remember what the other 2 were, or maybe there was I did it like 2 different times, and one time was I got Alex Ross's Justice volumes 1, 2, and 3. Then I had to find something else. And that was when I just sat down and read and was like, wow, this is a strong story. And it's good. It's a really good story, and it deals with a deep theme. And we won't go into spoiler territory, but, it's interesting how many of us have that time period, like you stated, where you go away from comics. And I think sometimes, I know for me, a lot of it was access to them. There wasn't a comic shop around. And then when I went to college, there was a shop near the college. So that helped me get back into it. And then we had a great public library that actually got on like Marvel and DC got their monthly issues.
Mm-hmm.
So that helped get back into reading more continual. And I think that's the hardest part is when I was a kid, we had a shop, but it was not really easy to get to. And sometimes, it was out of the way. Parents didn't always want to go. And then when you'd get there, you'd find a book or something. And I remember when the X-Men TV series was so popular, of course, you want to get X-Men comics. And that was when they were the Jim Lee books. But they weren't always the easiest to read as a kid. I'm getting these books with this, and I'm like, okay, this is cool, but I don't know what's going on because this story doesn't really match with the cartoon I'm watching. So it's interesting how that sometimes can cause issues when you try to do something to get people into the books, but then they have a hard time. And I feel like nowadays you've got different outlets, and of course we have the digitals, so we now know where you got back into comics. What were your favorite characters to read? Just period. You said Batman.
Yep, Batman. I would say X-Men, Avengers, trying to think like Superman. It kind of ran the gamut. The Avengers, Daredevil, Spider-Man. Those are some of the big ones that have stuck with me, and I've continued on with them. I probably didn't get into kind of things like Vertigo and that kind of line until probably college. That when I really kind of grew in my kind of appreciation of the genre, how it could grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, there's some stories, like you said, like you might read and then you don't quite grasp how good it is or how layered it is. And then you go back and read it so many years later and you really get a new handle on the material. So let's transition a little bit and think about when you were reading Batman per se, did you have a certain, a lot of times with comic people, you'll have people who identify more with the writer, people who identify more with the artist. Was there any certain writer or artist that you like kind of followed?
I would say, with my younger years, I really didn't follow writer or artist because I liked the character. And we kind of talked about this even in our network chat time, even on World's Finest, that as we get older, I became more of a follower of writers and artists. Now these days, like people like Ed Brubaker, John Phillip, John Murphy, Jeff John, Donny Cates, just name kind of a few at that point. And I'm obviously missed a whole bunch.
Oh yeah, I mean
that was Scott Snyder. Just to name a few at the top of my head as they start pouring in, like Peter Tomasi, and Darwin. Exactly. I start going Darwin Cook, and so just to name a few, and just because either their art, their storytelling connected to me on a personal level, and so that as I got older, that's something that I more appreciated, and I really kind of gravitate toward, even though I like characters, I more appreciate the artists, the writers that are usually kind of the ones that I think do the best job with.
And I agree. Like there are artists that I like that I'll kind of like, oh, they're drawing this book, but what's the character? And then there are writers. I feel like I follow the writer more than the artist. Mm-hmm. And that's why I always kind of ask, like, when you're reading a comic, what kind of sells it for you?
Yeah.
Some people is more about the art, the images, and as much as, yes, that is very important in comics. Mm-hmm. I tend to follow the writers and really, dig into that aspect of them. So what books are you currently reading, like on a month-to-month basis? Any certain titles you're really like following now, or do you not have time for that because you're too busy doing your podcast where people are assigning you books to read?
No, I do find time. I'm reading most of a good chunk of the Bat Family titles for DC. Swamp Thing, Nightwing. That ties to the Bat Family, something I recognized at that point. I'm trying to think anything for DC wise. I'm not a fan of what's going on with JLA. I'm not a fan of, it might be heresy, but I'm not a fan of. I like Brian Michael Bendis. I just don't like what his take on the JLA is going on now. I love Tom Taylor's work on Superman, Son of Kal-El. I think that's, it's only a few issues in, but I'm really enjoying that. On the Marvel side, Avengers, Spider-Man, X-Men, Daredevil, kind of like my standard go-tos. I've been a kid, and it's continuing going on there. Even Captain America.
Nice. It's a nice broad spectrum, and there's so many good of the big titles like that sometimes it's hard to appreciate and get back into some of the smaller titles. You were talking about Tom Taylor. I am reading Nightwing and, Son of Kal, because I really like Tom Taylor's work back when I read the year 1 of Injustice that he did. That's when I first learned, like, got on my radar, was then. And I've kind of tried to, if he was writing something I was interested in, and I like reading the Bat books. Sometimes the Bat books feel like they can be a rabbit hole, the way that, because there's so many different characters and they orchestrate the stories over like multiple titles. So sometimes I have to reel myself back in. But since Tom Taylor took over Nightwing, that became a monthly book. And I haven't read Batman since Fear State started.
Yeah, I've enjoyed the idea of Fear State. It's okay. It's definitely it's an interesting concept. I'd just say it's right now. It's okay. I've come to the end of it, but it's interesting.
As a person that you are, where you read a lot of different comics and different things, my biggest issue with certain comics and events is I feel like they start strong, and then when they end, it kind of just goes. It ends like in a place where you're like, or the ending is so big with like so much going on, and just the artwork is ridiculous that you lose the story. Mm-hmm. And my problem with the Batman books, I feel like there's almost become a formulaic cycle to some of it. Mm-hmm. Like how they did Joker War, and I won't even go down the whole of. I feel like the Joker's just being thrown everywhere anymore. That it's not even special anymore. It's just like, here he is in this side book, and this side book, and this side book, and his own title, and
yeah, it's. I think the problem when you get into kind of event is, A, the length of that event, and B, the number of tie-ins, things like that. The longer the event, the more amount of tie-ins. It kind of, like you said, it kind of loses its luster of what, especially when the tie-in seems forced. Mm-hmm. Like they had a story going on, and then they're forced to stop said story to tie in with the event. And sometimes they are really good, and sometimes they're just forgettable and just as a cash grab. And so I'm trying to think of an event in my mind that, I'll even use it right now, that actually I think, even though it's only 2 or 3 issues in, I think it has potential. It's Tom Taylor's Marvel's Dark Age. It's fascinating in a sense, without revealing too much. If people haven't started reading it, like I said, 2 issues in, that it's an alternate universe, alternate Marvel universe, where something happened and the heroes lose, and they lose huge, so much so that the Earth is forever changed. Zombies are not involved this time.
That's nice. That's good.
But like I said, the heroes lose, they lose huge. And it's how the Earth necessarily is coping with this massive loss.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That sounds good.
So, there's no tie-ins right now. I don't believe Tom Taylor has any tie-ins. It's simply a mini-series event book. But again, it's not in Marvel 616, canon.
Okay. See, that makes it a little bit more interesting for me to feel like I could pop in, join the book, and not have the weight of everything else. Like last year, DC did a small little event that kind of got overlooked that was interesting, was the Endless Winter. Mm-hmm. And that was such a weird kind of story, because you had it appear in different titles for one issue, and then at that time, I think Superman had ended. So there was Superman Endless Winter. So there was an issue just specifically entitled Superman Endless Winter. Mm-hmm. And then you had the story appear there was no Endless Winter 1, Endless Winter 2. The chapters were just in different titles.
Yeah.
And it was okay, this is weird. And it's just sometimes you wonder why they do these things. Or, there was a time I remember when DC Comics felt like they were doing these what would be events every month, and they would just throw them out there in every title. Like the Future's End was a big Batman Beyond story that was basically felt like DC's Days of Future Past that just kind of got lost in the shuffle. And then and then they did Superman Doomed, which I thought was a great story, and I feel like it got overlooked. And that was a really interesting property, but that's another rabbit hole we could go down. So when you have your guests on your show and you're deciding, what comics, is there any kind of comics that you are more excited to get into, or any comics that you're like, I don't really want to do that one, but you do it anyways?
That I've done in World's Finest?
Yes.
I think, and I don't want to say it just because it's not.
No, you're fine.
There's only been one in the entirety, just because I hadn't read it, but I hadn't heard a lot of positive stuff about it. But, again, the guest chooses the book. It wasn't, I still give the same gusto of it at that point. And there was actually one, and I'll say it on this one just because we do joke about it even on his return. First Time Dave from DVDs, and this was the one that I'm referring to. Like I said, there's only been one book that got into it, wasn't necessarily thrilled with it, and then at the end, just like, okay, it lowered expectations. But a different one was when Dave from DC On Screen, his first time on, and he's like, I want to do Superman for tomorrow. And he said, when I read it the first time, he was, he said, it wasn't connecting with me. So it's been a number of years. I want to try to give it another shot and see if I have a better outlook on it. Well, when we got on getting ready to record, he's like, I've got something to tell you. And he's like, what? I said, I didn't like it anymore. He says, I understand if you want to not do this episode. I said, no, let's do it and see if we can not necessarily paint it with a good light, but try to see if there is some good parts and kind of talk about why it's a show of celebration, but why it didn't die. And so it's one of those rare episodes that I think is one of my favorites, and it's one of the funniest ones we've done. But I mean, one of the biggest things, Jim Lee's art, that was one of the biggest saving graces of it. And I think the problem, and I think we said it even on that episode, I think the problem is I personally do like Brian Azzarello, but I think he's got a certain knack for a certain type of character. He's really good at writing Batman. He's really good at writing very dark and gritty, very cliche terms these days, but dark and gritty stories. Superman he might have had a story there, but it just didn't connect. It didn't land. It seemed very odd.
Yes.
And it just didn't land. And again, I like Brian Azzarello. It just, that one, I just don't think Superman's the character for him back.
I agree. I totally agree. I don't think every writer can do every character justice. Like you were talking about Brian Azzarello, his work with Lee Brahamo when they did Batman Damned. That was a very interesting story. And it's much different. And he did, which one of the before Watchmen did he do? I'm trying to remember, because I read them all together, but I remember liking what he did. But yeah, you're right. That Superman story just has it. There's something about it, and I haven't read it in a while, but I remember when I did read it, I had those exact same thoughts, like, if I just read this story, how would I feel compared to having this art to go with it? Now, being exposed to all the different comics you are exposed to and so, do you have a couple that you'd like to kind of plug that you recommend for our listeners to check out from any, publisher?
Okay, so if I had to pick one book right now to plug at.
Well, like something that surprised you, like maybe
something that surprised me.
Yeah, that like you don't talk about, just like, hey, I read this. It was one I hadn't read or had little knowledge of, and I really think you should read this because it's nice to be exposed to more content that maybe doesn't get brought up. So what are some things that you would recommend people to check out?
I would say I'm going to go down to. Ed Brubaker is one of my go-tos for if his name is on it, I'm buying it, sight unseen. But he's very much outside of he's very much on creator-owned content. One of the ones I think that you don't see a lot of airplay with him, but I think it's one of his best work is the story of the Fade Out. It basically takes place in 1950s, post World War II Hollywood, and a murder has happened in Hollywood, and it's all revolving around this kind of seedy side of Hollywood. The mob's involved. You get an occasional glimpse of real life actors and actors players. And if you're a big fan of the movie L.A. Confidential, this has a lot of L.A. Confidential vibe. And so it I believe 4 issues, if I'm not mistaken, and it's just a one-off kind of thing. It shows how good Brubaker does at doing noir, and that's bread and butter. So that is one that I would definitely recommend checking out. Hard, like when you put on the spot, it's like, oh my goodness, of course I don't come prepared.
Oh no.
I would also get sorry, I might have to do a little editing.
Nah, you're fine. I mean, with the LA Confidential, that was like one of my favorite. So those movies I saw when I was younger, and I liked, and the older I've gotten, revisiting and just enjoying more. And then I actually read the script 2 years ago, I think it was. I had a copy of the script and I read it, and it was interesting. One thing I always loved about that movie, and this is going down a tangent here, but the fact that to make Russell Crowe look bigger, that they have a scene where they have guys walk down the stairs, but then Russell Crowe comes in. There's like a cut, edit, tweak that the doorway that he walks in is actually smaller than the doorway we saw the other guys walk down, so it gives the impression that he's a bigger dude than what he is. Just little tricks that they used in that movie.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies, and I'm a big crime noir kind of person, so it's just right up my alley. For when I originally discovered it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is something special. Probably I'm looking at some stuff I've read in comicsology lately. If I would say it's really far outside and it's going to come off as like really a Disney story, The Complete Life and Times of Scrooge Mcduck.
Nice. You heard it.
People say, "Oh, Don Rosa and his dedication to the Duck comics at that point is something to be definitely just applauded and admired." But The Complete Life and Times of Scrooge Mcduck, it's 2 volumes. And you're like, why would I want to read this? It's one of those books that has a special place in my heart, just because it gave me a different perspective on this character, and just seeing the journey this character made. This is taking the Disney character Scrooge Mcduck and giving it a lot of heart and a lot of character development. And so that would be one. And I'll do one more that I just did a episode on World's Finest True Believers. I actually did one on Fade Out with Scott from DC Squadcat with the Fade Out. But this one is one that very much life-changing for me, was the book Day Tripper. And
I'm not with that.
Yeah, Day Tripper is now been put under the DC Black Label book. It's not superhero related. It's not anything. It's by Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba, or Gabriel Ba. It very simply, you are going through different moments, different years, age of this one individual's life at different points. Like, you'll start off with maybe, age 27, and then it'll flash back at one point. One issue is dissipated to one moment in a day when he's 27, and then it'll flash back. It'll flash forward to a different part, and it goes to different parts. But every single issue is going to end the same way. I can't tell you what that is, because it's part of the journey of it. And the message that book brings about what life at that point, there are so many times I've read this book like 4 or 5 times, and it draws me to tears at different points, and how beautiful the art is, but also how beautiful the written. I mean, these are brothers, and they have written and drawn this book like just, it is if they just did this one thing and never did anything else again, that would be the thing for them. It's one of those rare absolute editions that has nothing to do with superhero. I mean, that is how believable, that's how important this book is, that even DC put a non-superhero book in absolute form.
I'm in. You know, that sounds good.
And I caution anyone to read a true synopsis of it, because it will give it away. And I caution you and the listeners to this, just try not, just listen to what I've told you and just go in with that, because if you read any more, most synopsises will give away the big shit, the big moment.
I'm going in cold. I'm just going to read.
And the guest on that episode, Mark, who's one of the co-hosts of Comic Book Legion, when I recommended that book to him, because he was like, I need some books to recommend. I'm worried about not finding my love of comics anymore, things like that. I said, read Day Tripper. It will literally change your life. And he said on the show, it literally saved him from leaving comics.
And I mean, I think that right there, it kind of goes back to what I was saying, where you start to see the formula of the writing, where some of the big companies don't let characters evolve. Yeah. You do this story, and then as soon as the next team comes in, they retcon stuff and they throw stuff out, and you just get tired of it. But, you know, having these off series or these different kinds, I think it really is what helps keep that love alive. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about Scrooge Mcduck. I mean, hey, I love the new DuckTales cartoon they did because it layered the history of Della and Scrooge and the Huey, Dewey, and Louie. Mm-hmm. And even when they did the Batman parody type thing when they brought in Darkwing Duck, mm-hmm. was awesome. So, yeah, don't worry about Scrooge Mcduck on this cast. We got your back.
Yeah, like I said, give it a shot. It's not what you'd expect.
So we're going to kind of wrap up here shortly, but before we do, this is a Superman-based podcast. We got some questions for you. Have you watched Superman and Lois?
Yes, loved it.
Awesome. That's what we wanted to hear. Okay, we're good.
No, I think it was the one show that, going into it, the CW do it. They've done Supergirl. They introduced Tyler Hoechlin's character, Superman, his version of Superman onto it. So when they were doing a Superman and Lois show, focus on him as a dad, I said, okay, let's see. And, full transparency, I'm a huge Zack Snyder fan. I love Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Zack Snyder's Justice League. And knowing my dedication to that franchise and what Zack was trying to do with it, there are many, many times I see the tip and nod of the hat to what Man of Steel and what he's done with that. But I think what that show does so well, and I wish they would bring back to Flash, is the heart. Mm-hmm. And even though it's just one season, they brought so much depth and character to both Superman, Clark, and Lois, the kid, that it's not a perfect show by any means. It is absolutely not a perfect show, but it's done something that it brought something to this, and I hope it continues on and they don't forget to lose that heart, because I think what makes that show so good is just the family aspect that time they spent. I mean, they brought even more depth and character to this version of Lois Lane. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to ruin, because there's one particular episode, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, that really paints Lois in an arc that we've never seen, ever portrayed in any media about Lois Lane.
Yeah, I actually talked about that yesterday at another podcast, a friend of mine, of how that particular arc touched me and Jania a lot stronger, just because of our history. And, you talk about, you wish they'd bring it back to the Flash. It's interesting because Todd Helbing is the showrunner, head writer for Superman and Lois, but he was one of the core writers for the Flash. and then he later went on to this. So it's like, I think that's a skill set that he has. And, I feel like, okay, with Tyler Superman in this show, and I won't go down this whole rabbit hole, but I feel they look back, and I could see them in the writing room thinking, what did people like about Henry Cavill as Superman? What did people like about Christopher Reeve? What did people like about Smallville? And they just kind of mapped it out, and then they made, for lack of a better term, greatest hits Superman.
Mm-hmm.
So you really feel a nod and a connection to all those versions, and they blend it so well. And spoiler alert, that's kind of my theory on what's going to be like watching the Batman movie. Mm-hmm. They sat back and like, what did people like about Keaton? What did they like about what Nolan did? What did they like about Snyder's Batman? All right, we're going to blend all that together and make our Batman. So, I think it's a big win for everybody when the characters are done correctly, and it's not so much we're going to do this take on the character. It's like we're just going to do the character justice. We're now just going to move him a little further in his life than what we've seen him before, and that's what I loved about it. Is there any other comic book based shows that you're into right now?
I do watch most of the CW shows. I fell off of Legends of Tomorrow after, in my opinion, only what I've heard, of course, mouth Brendan Routh, how it seemed to have been, basically felt like fired from the show without really any cause. It felt like, I know he's coming back for the 100th episode, so I'll definitely watch that, but it just got too much jumping the shark for it. Legends be legends at that point. It's the show that I'm more surprised has stayed on, and it has reached 100 episodes, which I think is the big top for that show. Outside of the CW shows, Doom Patrol, Titan, Young Justice, posting a Marvel show. Obviously, I've watching all the Marvel stuff, Loki, What If, the WandaVision, Falcon and Winter Soldier. So most superhero stuff I'll usually be watching.
I'm the same. I'll at least watch my rule is I'll always watch at least the first episode or first two to give it a shot. But I've watched everything. Legends is the show that I've given up on because I don't feel like it's a DC show anymore. Mm-hmm. Because all the big DC characters they've taken out, and all the characters on there now are either altered versions of the DC character they once were, or they're CW original characters. And it doesn't feel like, I went back and watched the pilot episode. It's a completely different show.
Oh yeah, no, it has grown. I mean, and again, for those people that like it, great. I'm never going to be the one to say, oh, you're an idiot for liking that at all. Different strokes for different strokes. And my breaking point was what happened with Brandon Routh on the show. So
I agree. Like, I tried to watch last season just kind of in the background, because that's kind of what I did with Batwoman. Like, I'd kind of turn it on just to kind of hear what's going on, if there's anything interesting, and I'd be doing other stuff like laundry or dishes or whatever. But after a while, I just completely gave up on Legends. But I've been watching everything else you've named. What has been your favorite Disney Plus Marvel show?
I would have to say they're very different shows, so it's always and you could say it's different movies at that point, but they all bring in something very different, and it's a different kind of genre they're emulating. I would say it's kind of a tie between Loki and Falcon and Winter Soldier. And just because I put WandaVision below the two is not because I think WandaVision is a bad show by any stretch. I just think the more I've reflected on what I really liked about it, I think the bringing in of Isaiah Bradley and the real-life commentary issues that they dealt with in that show really kind of resonated with me, and stuff I never thought I'd see a Marvel property deal with. And Loki, just for what it's doing to Marvel and what it led to. And like I said, WandaVision is a great show. It's just something's got to be ranked below it. And the other two shows were really good. I did like how WandaVision really dealt with mental health, and didn't shy away from those issues.
I agree with everything you say, but for me, just personally, I feel like WandaVision's my favorite Like, it's my number one.
Yeah.
Like you said, something has to be on the bottom.
Yep.
And I feel like Falcon and the Winter Soldier is on my bottom just because I feel like I wanted a little bit more out of that between Bucky and Sam.
Oh yeah, no, and I think that is. I've heard that argument, and I'm not swayed of it. I think, like we said, just what you latches onto you more. At the time, Wanda still beat Falcon and the Winter Soldier for me when it first came out. But the more I went back to it, more watched it, Falcon creeped up. Now, did WandaVision do something different than we had seen before? Yes, very much so. Falcon and Winter Soldier is very much mostly your typical kind of action MCU, but the more personal moments is what I connected more with on Falcon and Winter Soldier, those quiet moments, those less action moments. Now, if I were to rank what was the most innovative for all the Disney, WandaVision is the most innovative. Is the most, like, Marvel really getting very different. And then it goes Loki, and then at the bottom would be, Falcon, just because it's the most formulaic Marvel property.
See, and that, I mean, that is what's great about it is there's nothing that's bad. It's just what do you latch onto?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's it. I mean, I enjoyed What If. Yeah, I'm looking forward to its return.
Oh, yeah.
I look forward to Hawkeye. I look forward to all of it. I mean, yes, I'm more DC, but I have no hate towards Marvel. Like, I'm in on their shows just as well. I joked about how, this coming Thursday, it's just crazy because I'll have 3 new episodes of a DC show just on HBO on the same day. And I'm like, what a time, Like, even just thinking about the week ahead, like, I'll have a new Supergirl, a new Batwoman, a new Stargirl, a new Titans, a new Doom Patrol, a new Young Justice, and then if you throw in Legends, before the week is over. And, before we had like that we lived in a time period, folks, when there would be like one show. Mm-hmm. You had your one like comic book based show, and now I just named 7 in a week just from one one company. But Chris, I just want to thank you. We could keep going here. We have like an open conversation just about love for comics, and I wanted to get you on just to kind of talk a little bit, but let people know more about your show from your perspective, and just kind of get to know you more. Is there anything you want to plug or where people can find you and communicate with you online?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Chris Balga. My 2 shows, World's Finest True Believers, you can follow it at Finest Believers, and Marvel Alliance, you can follow on Twitter at Marvel A Podcast. Both shows are on the Geek Ultimate Alliance Network feed, so you can look up Geek Ultimate Alliance Network, or just Geek Ultimate Alliance Network, whatever, Geek Ultimate Alliance on any of your podcatchers of choice. Marvel Alliance is on the main network feed. That's where you can find all 8 shows we have on the network. But if you're just interested in Marvel Alliance does also have a separate feed, so you can look at Marvel Alliance is a separate feed, but the only way you find World's Finest True Believers drop every other Monday on the Geek Ultimate Alliance feed.
All right, and if you want to go back, I think it was in was it in early 2020 or 2019?
2020, because you were the first show. Your episode on Birthright was very first World's Finest on the network. So you could easily search, if you searchable podcatchers, you can literally look up that episode and your American Vampire episode.
Yes, and that's what I was trying about. Time over the past years has kind of started to blend. So I had to think. But yes, go back, check us out as we talk about Superman Birthright. It is something that we have not dived greatly into on the podcast because of a couple of small things. But also because you and I had that conversation, and I want people to go over and check our discussion out on that property. So check out that episode, everybody. Check out the podcast. Get into some comics that maybe you're not reading. And remember,
look up in the sky.
The Krypton Report is a Tears production. We thank you for listening and enjoying, and please support us on our Patreon account, our TeePublic store, and check out our social media. Always remember to look up in the sky.